My name is Karl Skorecki. I'm a physician, nephrologist or kidney specialist.
Okay.
I'm Director of Medical and Research Development at the Rambam Healthcare Campus in Haifa, and a professor in medicine and head of the Laboratory of Molecular Medicine at the Technion, Israel Institute of Technology.
Perfect. And what is your connection to studies in Jewish genetics?
I've been doing research in population genetics of populations of interest around the world, especially related to kidney disease, but also Jewish history genetics for about 20 years.
Oh, interesting. Okay. So the question is, are the Jewish people of today directly related to the Israelites of the Bible?
We don't have DNA from Israelites of the Bible, so there's no way to provide a direct answer to your question. It may be that someday, actually in the near future, because there are researchers working on this, on what's called truly ancient DNA, that is to say, obtaining DNA from the remains of peoples who are no longer with us, but their skeletons or the remains buried in sites in the contemporary state of Israel and the surrounding region, and that those DNA sequences one day can and probably will be compared with those of many people around the world, including contemporary Jews. But there isn't a direct published answer to that question at the moment.
Okay, fair enough.
So the closest we can get is sort of circumstantial, and that circumstantial kind of evidence, which is not direct, is based on comparing DNA sequences and DNA markers of members of contemporary Jewish, self-identified Jewish communities, either in Israel or in various diaspora communities, with each other and with markers of other people currently living or having lived in, who claim to either currently live in pre-state Israel or what was then Palestine, their DNA sequences, or surrounding Near East populations, that is Levantine populations in Syria, Lebanon, the Druze population, Jordanians, etc. So those comparisons provide some insight. Also comparing DNA sequences of Jews with those of their non-Jewish neighbors in the diaspora of Europe or Northern Africa or Iraq or the Americas, etc., those comparisons put together can give us circumstantial insights, and a lot of those studies have been done. But that
and what do they say? That's bottom line. What do they say about Jews?
So bottom line, they say that self-identified Jews, and also, by the way, I can come back to this later, people who don't, who have some notion of potential Jewish ancestry but do not identify themselves as Jews. So that is, for example, descendants of the conversos or members of other communities. But let's just stick with self-identified Jews today. Many Jews in most who come from most diaspora communities, that is North Africa, the Middle East, so Iraq, Iran, all the way to India, Europe, wherever they are today. So I'm talking about people, maybe today they live in America, but their ancestors are from Europe, or they live in Israel and their ancestors are from Morocco. So I'm using their ancestry as it was 2 generations ago, for example, and say, okay, what do their DNA markers show? So they show that there is a high degree of relatedness to each other. That is to say, Jews, self-identified Jews from Morocco, from Lithuania, from Iraq, have a great affinity of markers to each other, indicating that they have common ancestry, and the closest non-Jewish populations that one can find them, those markers related to, are Levantine populations, non-Jewish Levant populations, that is, Druze, Palestinians, Syrians, Cypriots. Those would be the closest, rather than their non-Jewish neighbors of the far-flung diaspora communities. That's sort of a bottom line.
Is it fair to
Yeah, go
is
ahead.
it fair to say that somebody who came from Poland is more related to somebody who is Middle Eastern than their Polish neighbors would have been 100 years ago? Or what is the percentage? Is there any way to know?
Yeah, there's lots of studies published and lots of numbers, and I think it's really important to get to a particular concept of what the word relatedness means. There's two kinds of relatedness. One kind of relatedness is, I would say, genetic. How much of the genome do two people share with each other, or do members of two communities share with each other? That's a very different kind of relatedness than genealogic relatedness. That is to say, I may be genealogically related. That is, I may share a common paternal ancestor. I may come from the same father as someone, let's say, of the Lemba tribe in Zimbabwe recently, but we may not be very related across our genome. We may not share a lot of DNA sequence. So there are two kinds of relatedness. So if I break that down now, and I just take as an example European Jewry, okay? So European Jews, you can very clearly see the genealogic origins in the Near East, on the paternal side especially, but also the maternal side. On the other hand, if you look at their genome, who they share DNA with, they've been in Europe for quite a long time, and on average, this is an excellent study done by Shai Carmi, Professor Shai Carmi at Hebrew University recently actually, and he's shown that approximately 50% of the European Jewish genome is European, and about 50% is Near East. Not very surprising, right? But that Near East component is also found in whatever percentage of the Moroccan Jews have, or whatever percentage of Iraqi Jews have. So that gives you, and every diaspora community is slightly different, because it depends how much admixture there was, how much of the community was founded by men who married local non-Jewish women, and vice versa, etc. Mostly men who moved and intermarried with non-Jewish women. Happened in various communities, but you can still see the thread to the shared ancestry in the Near East.
Okay. What about, there's an alternative view by Dr. Eran El-Hayek, who talks about Turkish roots of the Jewish population. Why is he different?
Yeah. So I want to be careful in what I say. I'll say the following.
Sure.
That I think it's very important when conducting this kind of sensitive research that has potential ramifications about how people view themselves and how they view other populations, to do what's called hypothesis testing research. In other words, you have to set up a hypothesis, and you have to be prepared to refute it. That is to say, you have a hypothesis. I started this work, actually. You asked me why I'm a kidney doctor and why I'm doing this kind of work. Well, it is a fluke, really, because about 20-something years ago, I just came out with this fluky hypothesis that Jewish men who identify themselves as members of the priestly tribe, that is Kohanim, right? I'm a Trekkie, I'm a Star Trek fan, and I'm a Kohen myself. So I said, maybe men who have this tradition should, on the male part of their genome, that is the Y chromosome, maybe they share markers in a statistically more robust manner than any random group of men. And we set about to test that. And however, when we test such a thing, you have to be prepared to refute it. That is, we have to be prepared to say, okay, the answer is we don't find a statistical correlation. Well, we did find it, and we published it, and that was, I thought that would be the end of my involvement in that kind of work. Well, it was just the beginning. That got a lot of interest and press, much more than I anticipated, and then it kind of snowballed into turning me into this Jewish genetics research person as a really hobby, actually. It's not really my main line of work, but I'm still, you call me, other people call me, a lot of people call me, and it just led to more and more studies. PhD students came to work with me and stuff like that. So why did I do that diversion? Because I think, I don't want to speak specifically about Aaron al-Hayek, although I've met him and I read his work and stuff like that. I try to distinguish agenda-driven research, where you're trying to, you have this idea that the Khazars, are the ancestors of European Jews, and there's kind of a whole, movement of that type, which has, I think, some kind of is trying to make a point. And if you're looking at your research with the eye of proving that point, because it's important for you to prove that point, then you can see almost anything you want in research and data analysis and statistics.
Well,
if you begin and say, I have no idea, I could, by the way, if our work had shown that there was no connection of European Jews to the Near East, and rather they were much more connected to Caucasus populations, West Eurasian populations, that's fine. I could care less. It doesn't change anything about my life view, my view of myself. The fact that 50% of my genome is probably of European ancestry, not Levant ancestry, that doesn't affect my Jewishness view of myself, worldview. I think they're separate domains, the science, test hypothesis, and I have a feeling, I don't know, I could have a discussion if you want. I think you can, it's very important when you do research, analyze data, that you don't have a preconceived notion. You have a hypothesis, that's fine. You can base hypothesis on anything you like. It could be some narrative, it could be a biblical tradition, it could be anything. But you have to be prepared to refute it.
How does a layperson know which science to trust? I mean, he, I assume, is basing his views on science as well.
Yeah. So I'll tell you, I think an important point, and it's a very good question, right, is that I personally, and many of my colleagues, most of them formerly my students and others, people I collaborate with, are very, very careful, and maybe what I'm doing with you is an exception, I don't know, we don't engage, let's say, scientists or researchers who reach different conclusions in the public press domain, okay? In other words, let's say, until Aaron al-Hayek published his work, which he did in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, we didn't really address it. When he was questioning our work not in the scientific domain, but in the non-scientific domain, then it's not really something I need to deal with. Once he publishes a paper, which he did, which is peer-reviewed and is in a scientific journal, then I do feel that my colleagues and I need to address the data and then either agree with it or write what we think, and we did that. So we have very, I think... and
what did you say? I'm not aware of this.
There's I think, what I view as kind of the bottom line word, although, again, somebody comes and takes our most recent work on the Khazar. It's a paper that's specifically addressing, and I won't, bore you or the other listeners who are going to hear this at some point maybe, with all the details, but we specifically address questions of, who there's no Khazar person today. We can't go and say, here, you're a Khazar person, can we have your DNA? So you have to use surrogate populations who may be descendants of who might have been the Khazars.
Okay.
So we sample as broadly as possible anybody. So obviously we won't go to Japan, right, and say, okay, we're going to sample you. So we'll go broadly to as many populations as we can in Western Eurasia. That's what we did. And we take as unbiased an approach as possible. And then we say, okay, so let's test and see, what could be the controversy? So we did that. We did a very extensive study. It was peer-reviewed and published, and it basically, at least from the genetics, it has no linguistics in it. It doesn't have archival. It's just pure genetics.
Sure.
To my mind, as a scientist, and I'm an author, so I'm not unbiased, right? I'm one of the authors on the paper. but is quite thorough, and I think refutes a potentially valid hypothesis, namely a West Eurasian origin, that is a Khazar origin for European Jewry. I think the genetic evidence doesn't support that when it's done in this unbiased, thorough, comprehensive manner. Had it supported it, it's fine. We even had a paper a few years ago, which we found this small community, small group of Levites, Ashkenazi or European Levites. And I actually thought we had found the remnant, contemporary remnant of the Khazars, that they may have been like a small thread of people who were the descendants of the Khazars among European Jews. Well, in subsequent work, we found out that group actually, their markers are also of Near East origin. They're not West Eurasian. So we haven't been able to find the descendants of the Khazars at the moment, whoever they are, whether they be among Jews or non-Jews. And they certainly, from our genetic work, do not comprise any substantial or detectable portion of contemporary Ashkenazi Jewry, as far as we can tell. Again, if it did, fine, but we don't see it.
Okay. And just, I know you already touched on it, but how related are we Jews to Palestinians? Is there a way to put that into context or explanation?
Yeah, I think the best way to conceptualize it is that, before there were Jews, before there were Christians, before there were Muslims, before there were Palestinians, before there were any of these, there were people walking around here and engaging in agriculture and engaging in all kinds of activities for millennia before they became identified as what we understand today as current identities. And they were living here in the Near East, okay? And they, this was a way station for the out of Africa migrations. It was one of the way stations. So it was an area where many people mixed and intermixed. Came from Mesopotamia, came from Africa, went back and forth. There were all kinds of people. There was a pool of genetic variation in the Levant going back millennia. And Jews today and Palestinians today and other Levant populations, the Druze population, for example, being a very, we studied that population along with the Druze people themselves, are part of the investigative team. We can clearly see that we come from a shared pool. There's a shared genomic pool. The Jews, became, a self-identified people a few thousand years ago, floated around the world, and then some have come back to Israel, and others have not. The other Near East populations floated around the world less, and many of them, stayed put here. But we can see that emanation from a common pool. Jews, in their diaspora migrations, picked up DNA from their neighboring communities as well. So that's the relatedness. The relatedness is the shared ancestral origins, antedating Palestinians, Jews, Druze, and all these other currently named ethnicities.
Okay. Is there any way to put that into a number, meaning the percentage of genetics we share?
Again, I'm separating overall genomic relatedness from what's called genealogic origin, okay? So if you just take male genealogic origin, and just to look at the male origins, paternal origins, we'll call them, of contemporary European Jews, and this would also be true, I think, of many Jewish communities. You can see that well over 3/4, 70, something like that, of paternal lineages are shared Near East origin wherever you go, and look like, and of course the same is true of contemporary Palestinians and other current Levant populations. So that's on the male side. On the maternal side, it's more complicated. So it varies by community, and it depends to what extent the community was founded by very few people, and to what extent it was founded by a lot of people. So, our current understanding of, again, I'll go to European Jews because they've been the best studied, but North African Jews have been well studied as well, and the Bnei Israel from Mumbai have been studied. But on the female side, for example, and the Georgian Jews, the Jews of Gruzia, Georgia, have been well studied. If in many cases there is a clear imprint of what's called a strong maternal founder event, so a few women founded a large number of descendants, and in some cases they are local women, not from the Levant, and in other cases they obviously have come from the Levant. And there's currently an interesting scientific, I would say, difference of opinion, which needs to be resolved, as to the maternal founders of the European Jews. So we're quite sure, we being myself and some of my collaborators and colleagues like Doron Behar and others, that the founders of maternal founders of European Jews are of Near East origin, from the same pool, let's say, as Palestinians and Syrians and so forth. Not everyone agrees. Some think that they're of European origin. And that's really, I think, an appropriate scientific debate that needs to be continued and resolved and written up, and we'll do that. As far as overall relatedness, how related are we to Palestinians in terms of diseases and so forth? Well, or phenotypes or things that affect our character, how we look, stuff like that, right? So that's much more complicated because, as I mentioned, Jews have picked up culturally, socially, and genetically influences from wherever they've been. And you can see that in the genome quite easily.
Sure.
So there are many parts which are related. So there are many diseases, which I hate talking about diseases, but I'm a doctor, so I have no choice. So there are some genetic diseases where you can clearly see that the genetic origin occurred in a way that affects Palestinians, Jews, Syrians, and others equally. So that obviously those mutations occurred at a site before there was a separation of the populations or a separate identity established. They go back. So in that sense, we're very...
Meaning that don't affect, let's say, other Western or Eastern Europeans?
Correct, they don't. So, for example, you can take something like Tay-Sachs. Tay-Sachs is almost exclusively Ashkenazi. It doesn't affect non-Jews, but it also doesn't hardly affects, but much less affects non-Ashkenazi Jews. So these are mutations that occurred after the founding, let's say, of Ashkenazi Jews.
Yeah.
But there are mutations which are shared between Jews, non-European Jews, so-called Sephardi or Edot HaMizrach, the non-Ashkenazi Jewish world, whether it be North Africa, and Ashkenazi Jews. So they occurred, let's say, after the founding of the Jewish people, but before the dispersions. And then there are those which are shared with Levant non-Jewish populations, that is Palestinians, Jews, etc. There's some kinds of Parkinson's predispositions which are present among Arab and Jewish populations in a shared manner. So, and we find many examples like that. So, in that sense, we're related at those sites.
Well, thank you very much.
I hope that's helped.
It's been very helpful. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Okay. Have a good evening. You too.